We are coming into the home stretch on this primary surfacing series, and I wanted to do an entire video on CurvatureGraph, which might sound a little odd to some people, or maybe it's a tool that they've never used before or don't understand why they should be using it. But CurvatureGraph is really just a bedrock fundamental tool that should be used whenever you're making your primary curves, your primary surfaces. It's very useful when you're matching. It is just honestly just one of the things that should always be on your mind is, well, what does the curvature graph of this look like? And funny enough, it's such a basic and intuitive tool. I almost have a difficult time describing it because it just sort of describes itself visually so well. So I'll bring the tool up. I've got this really simple curve here. I always just do it from the command line. I'm a big fan of the command line in Rhino. Select objects for display. So you can select curves or you can select surfaces. Meshes won't have a curvature graph. Curves and surfaces will. So boom, here's our curvature graph. What's it telling us? And we can scale it up and down if we want. We can change the density, sort of how many of these hairs or combs. But what are we looking at? Well, we call this visual representation here. These are the curvature combs. And they say you can never define something by using the word that it's called, and so I'm going to really break that rule right now. The curvature graph shows the curvature, right? Again, I have a hard time explaining this, but if I move these close together, this thing bulges out, and it's telling me like, oh, it gets very, much more curvy here, as opposed to, if I bring this down here and I bring this down here, we've got less curvature and it's more evenly distributed, right? And so you can see this great just graphic visual representation of, does this curve have even curvature? Is that what I'm going for? Does it have little localized spikes in curvature? Do I want that? Do I not want that? Right? So it's just this great visual representation of what's going on. And one thing, that I love about it is that, if you say to yourself, the idea of this curve is that it's completely, we're going to call this convex. I mean, this would be concave from this side, but from this side, we're going to call it convex. So if you say to yourself, I think that this curve is, the idea of this curve is that it's completely convex. And you have your points turned off, maybe, and you don't have curvature graph up, you may say to yourself, looking at this curve, yeah, this is completely convex. It's the same, it's on the same side of my, my curvature doesn't cross zero, right? Because visually that's what it looks like, but you bring up your curvature graph, well, what's going on here, right? Well, the problem is this point relative to this point needs to come out this way in order for that to be the case. So, I have this open all the time when I am creating my master guide curves for making surfaces. This is just the most direct, intuitive, satisfying way of understanding what's going on with your curve. And you can use it in, obviously in 3D too, right? So we're doing everything in 2D. We're starting with a simple case. Curvature graph works wonderful in 3D, and we're going to get there too. So now let's talk about how we can use curvature graph to analyze the continuity between adjoining curves. So I'm going to take this curve that I created. I'm going to draw a line. That's an extension off of here. So I'm making a straight line that is by definition tangent to the end of this line, right? So I've done that. And I'm going to change degree on this. Make it degree 2. I'm going to turn my points on. This is all stuff that should be review at this point. So I've created something that's tangent. This is a straight line right now. It's tangent to this. And so I can move this, right? I can move this point because tangency is only determined by these sets of points. This is a shared point here, this point here, this point here. They're going to be collinear. They're going to be along the line, right? And I can show you that. If I go here, right? So these points exist along a line, and they can be anywhere along this line and keep this tangent, right? But we're talking about curvature graph. So if I bring up the curvature graph of these now, of these two lines, right, you can see, these two are tangent. And the curvature graph goes completely from one side of if we think about this as one single thing, right, one single expression, even though it's two lines, but you can see the curvature is positive here and it's negative here, and it instantly goes over the line, right? Shoots right over the line. So what the curvature graph looks like on curves that are tangent is that this line here should line up, should be tangent to this line here, is the way to think about it, right? So let me break that, and so I can show you the difference, right? So, okay, so you see how, this now angles this way, and this now angles this way. These are, you can see just visually like, oh, this is not tangent. This is not even close to tangent, right? And, if I do this here, right, you can see that this line here lines up with this line here. Now, you can always use your match command to make sure, not match surf, but just match, to make sure that curves are whatever continuity you want, right? So, if I was unsure of this, I would just use match to do it. But you can even just visually see with curvature graph here, right, that these two are indeed tangent with each other. Yeah. So this is what tangency looks like. You can have a complete discontinuity in these corners, but the direction of the combs need to line up, right? Hopefully that makes sense. So now let's talk about what this looks like at curvature. Well, at curvature continuous, and I can use match, but at curvature continuous, I'm going to give this one a little bit more curvature just so that we can kind of have fun with it. And I'm going to use match again. I'm going to match this by tangent again. Great. When you get to curvature continuous, these corners need to line up with each other. So, I can even do this. What's kind of crazy is I can use match, but I can get very, very close with this and understand what's going on just by visually moving it, right? Let me use match. So this to this, curvature, none. Actually, no, let's keep position here. Awesome. So, but what's important here, right, is that these now line up. Now I'm gonna exaggerate this here. Let's see if we can get this to let's see here. Okay, there we go. Let's do something like this where we have a lot. There we go. This is what we want to demonstrate. So I'm going to match these again. Great. Okay, this shows exactly what I want, which is that the corners match up. So this is what curvature continuous looks like, right? The corners match up, but this line here does not have to be smoothly flowing into this line here. So from a visual standpoint, these will still these could still appear to be two separate ideas, is one way to think about it. So, G2, curvature continuous, right? These are now lined up with each other, but the slopes here can be completely different. That's what G2 looks like. I'll note that there's one level of continuity above curvature that gets used fairly often, right? So tangent, well, positional is G0, tangent is G1, curvature, which we just did, is G2, and then there's one above called flow, or G3. And if I just undo here, let's go backwards a little bit. Okay. So flow continuity, right? We should be that these, right, that there's no disturbance in the curvature graph here. So like you can think of it as like the curvature graph itself should be, the curvature graphs themselves should be tangent. These combs, this line here, if they were to be tangent, then this would be flow continuous. Now, I'm on 5, and so 5 doesn't let me do flow in match. I believe that 7 does. But what's really cool is that you can really easily visually see if things are flow continuous or close to it, right? So, you can think of matching too as a little bit of a tolerance, not an absolute. And so if something is very close to flow, it's going to be indistinguishable from it being one single thing. That's a great way to think about flow. Like, well, what does flow look like? Well, flow looks like you're expressing one single thing, if that makes sense, or it's indistinguishable from a single curve or a single surface on the curvature level. The continuity is with flow, right? So I'm just going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to use VSR here because VSR does have a flow matching, just to show you what happens when these things get lined up, right? And what it looks like. Cool. So now, right, these combs perfectly line up here. And just like, like this, right, this point controls tangency, this point controls curvature, this point controls flow. So what we know about this point is if we move this point, it's not going to move the amplitude of the comb here. It's not going to move the angle of the comb here, right? The angle gets moved by this first point, the tangency point. Also, the amplitude gets moved there too, right? So I can, both amplitude and angle change with this first point, right? This one only controls amplitude, right? You can see it's only going up or down. We're losing curvature, but it's only going up or down, right? And then this last fourth point here controls just the angle of the comb right here. And so you can use this knowledge of which point does what to directly manipulate the curvature graphs of your input curves or even your surfaces, right? So this is, I think of this as the flow point, this last one here. And, you can play around with it and even just graphically set something either flow or very close to flow, right? Oh, it's being silly now. Right. Those 2 points are very close together. That's why, right? So back to there, right? So that is a really great way, like curvature combs, curvature graphs can really tell you a lot just at a glance about the continuity of your curves. And then you can use that, and then you can use it to directly edit it so that, when I'm making my input curves, I have this idea in my mind now of what my curvature graph should look like. And then I'm able to just directly manipulate the points so that the curvature graph is doing that thing in my mind that I want it to do. So now let's talk about how we can use this tool in our workflows to make better models, right? And so much of my background is in the aviation industry, and I'm getting ready to do an entire, very long, deep dive on airfoils. And what I see over and over and over again is the same problems that people make when they're converting airfoils into NURBS curves and then using those curves to make surfaces. And if they'd only stop at the beginning to look at the curvature graph of their conversion, right, these alarm bells would start going off. But because people don't use curvature graph in these instances, they just keep plowing ahead. So I get these phone calls fairly often where people say, hey, I'm lofting this aero surface, that attaches to my wing. Say it's a wingtip or a wing root fairing, and I just can't get it to act right. It's wrinkly. It's having problems. I don't know what's going on. And sometimes it's skill and knowledge. But my first question is always, well, what does your wing loft look like? Is your wing loft clean? Oh, yes. It's totally clean. It's completely clean, is the answer I always get. And then the first thing I do is I bring up the curvature graph on the wing, and it's a horror show. So there's, for those people in the aviation industry, there's all these different airfoil coordinates. I'm gonna do a whole deep dive on this. But looking at this is an airfoil cross section. This is a riblet cross section, which should also there's a certain amount of controversy around the work that Mr. Riblet did, which I think is well deserved. So, but these airfoils come in as just points, and then you can create a degree 1 polyline. You can convert that degree 1 polyline into an interp curve that fits the points, and that's the point at which most people stop. And what they should really be doing is bringing up, here, let me turn off the degree 1 polyline. What they should really be doing, right? So this is my a degree 5 interp curve version of this airfoil. And if I bring up the curvature graph on this, holy smokes, it's a nightmare, right? We've got spikes, we've got zero crossings. We have multiple zero crossings right here at the leading edge, right? And this is, after fiddling around with this is, all of your warning lights should be flashing right now when you see something like this as an input curve for making a surface. This tells you that something has gone really seriously wrong. If you look back here, look, we've got all this in and out zero crossing here. We're sort of using a microscope, so to speak. We're really being nitpicky, but even back here, this thing is wobbling back and forth. We have these zero crossings of so it goes, concave, convex, a little tiny bit. Now, I will say, some of this stuff is going to get buffed out, quote unquote, if this is, say, made out of sheet metal, right? You're definitely asking sheet metal to do things that it can't do. But when you start making composite laminar wings, well, your curvature graph starts to really matter. So in things like the aero world, when you're creating fairing curves for boats, right? There's a real there's a big overlap in my mind between the problems here and the problems that end up in hull lofting, sort of with all the auto generation hull lofting software packages out there. But this should tell you everything you need to know about this airfoil, which is that this is a really bad airfoil, and this is going to making all the ancillary surfaces that attach to my airfoil much, much more difficult if I don't do something about it. So here's one final example of how we can use CurvatureGraph in primary surfacing. Right, we're in 3D now, right? We've talked about curves a lot. This is the box corner that I did in episode 12, the slightly more complicated one. And if I run CurvatureGraph on this surface here, we can see that we've got these really nice smooth combs. And let's bring these up too. Yeah, wonderful. Right, so this is what we would want in our mind the curvature graph for a surface like this to look like. Right, it's very sane. I can also add these objects here. Let's grab these. Right, and you can see that, like, look right here. Like, you've got curvature here, and then you can see visually, like, look, the corners meet. That's what G2 curvature continuous looks like. And these corners meet here. Right? So this is all what you would expect. Now, if I, instead of creating the surface the way that I did and matching it and all that, right? Instead, I use sort of everyone's favorite way to fill a hole, network surf. I'm just going to put this in here with network surface. I'm going to do everything to curvature. Right? I'm going to say, yeah, I want everything to be curvature. I want this to be smooth. I'm doing class A stuff, so I'm checking the curvature box, right? Well, just looking at this, it's like, oh, that's not great, right? You can tell it's kind of lumpy, but the best way to troubleshoot this is to run CurvatureGraph on it. And it's almost hard to see, sort of hurts the eyes. But you can see we've got these very, very uneven, spiky curvature graphs in here, right? There's these localized peaks, right? So, internally, this is the thing, is, you can have a single surface, and internally, it can be no better than G2 on itself, right? So it's acting like a bunch of different surfaces that are crammed together. It's not actually even acting like one single span surface. So this is a great illustration here of why do we care about single span surfaces. It's like, well, if we want to have control and we want to get good curvature, right? Well, then we don't want something that looks like this. I mean, this is, look at this huge dip in here. It just sort of, spikes up and then crashes down. And, this is, there's too many points in here. You can't point edit this. There's no way to constructively change this surface, right? And the best way to figure out what's going on, in my mind, is using CurvatureGraph. That's a great, great way to do it. Because maybe, maybe you're G2, maybe you are indeed G2 with these edges. But is this surface acting the way that you want it to act? I'd say it's not. And the way that you can see that the most direct way is through CurvatureGraph. All right. So I hope that you got a lot out of that. Like I said, we're coming into the home stretch here on the primary surfacing series. So I think I've got just one or two more, and then we're going to start doing some longer subject-specific tutorials. So anyway, I hope that you got something out of this. Like, comment, subscribe. That's what everybody's supposed to say. Whatever. Yeah. Thanks for watching. Stay safe.